Okay, we are live here. I'm with Virginia Palacios of Commission Shift. This is SJ, and we're joining you to give you an update on the Railroad Commission's open meeting that happened this morning. So our oil and gas agency has monthly open meetings, and there's hundreds of agenda items, and we're taking some time to slow it down and explain what some of those items mean, and discuss them and how the decisions that this very important but under the radar state agency, how those decisions affect the rest of us here in Texas. So we're here with Virginia, who's going to walk us through. Virginia, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so some of the first items we were looking at on the agenda were items 2 through 4. So these were permit applications from Pilot Water Solutions LLC for injection wells into the Delaware Mountain Group. And these are specifically saltwater disposal wells that would be injecting into a productive oil and gas zone. And so these permits were protested by ConocoPhillips and Solaris Water Midstream. ConocoPhillips was saying that fluids that have been injected into the Delaware Mountain Group are already impacting their oil and gas wells. And so that's why they were protesting these permits. Solaris also and Conoco also looked at the modeling that Pilot Water Solutions had put together. And ultimately, even the Railroad Commission concluded that there was a very low margin of error in the pressure differentials between the surface level hole pressure and the bottom hole pressure. I don't know too much about how the pressure differentials are supposed to work with these types of injection wells, but that was what was noted on the case summary for this. And so there were some sort of concerning elements about this. The Delaware Basin is the basin where the Railroad Commission in the last couple of meetings has developed new guidelines for permitting injection wells. And so because they have been having so many earthquakes in this part of the state in West Texas caused by underground injection, the Railroad Commission has decided to expand the area of review for these types of injection wells from a 1/4 mile to a 1/2 mile. And they're also just requiring more reporting, and they're also not going to permit deep injection wells in these areas as well. And so there's definitely more scrutiny going on from the Railroad Commission in this particular part of the state, but they approved 2 of the injection wells today and they denied 1 of the injection well permits. So still permitting here, it's just looking different. And one of the issues that is of concern is that when you stop permitting deep well injection and you instead move to shallow well injection, those shallow injection wells end up in the same intervals as a lot of oil and gas wells. And it's more likely that they're either going to impair oil and gas production, or they are going to, we're going to see more fluids coming up through unplugged well bores. And so there are some risks in this part of the state right now because there has been just so much development and there's such a high rate of injection at this time.
Um, Virginia, could you tell us a little bit more about what injection wells are typically used for, what gets injected in them?
Sure. So water that's produced along with oil and gas that's naturally occurring in the oil and gas formations is called produced water. It has high salt content and a lot of times high radionuclide content. Ordinarily, it would be considered hazardous, but there was a loophole called the Halliburton loophole that passed in an energy bill in 2005 at the federal level, and that exempts this particular type of operation. Well, it exempts oil and gas operations from being considered hazardous waste. And so you have to get a class 2 injection well permit to inject this waste underground. And underground injection has typically been thought of as the safest place to dispose of this type of produced water. But now, because we're having so many problems with underground injection, operators are looking to discharge it into rivers and streams or use it for some other type of beneficial use. But there haven't been any health standards set up for produced water reuse yet. And so we really are hoping that our state laws catch up and do that kind of thing before we start seeing beneficial reuse of treated produced water at a wide scale.
Thanks for that background context. I know that that seems like a very tricky problem for the industry because there seems to be no good place for waste of that type, whether it's deeply injected or shallowly injected or discharged out into the world. None of those have really good outcomes, it seems. So with this agenda item, what would you say, good, bad, or ugly with
I
their
mean, it's good to see that the commission didn't just outright approve all of the permits, but it's still, it still gives me cause for concern, given some of the other situations that are going on there.
Cool. Well, the next item that we flagged has to do kind of jumping ahead to the executive report or executive admin section of the open meeting. There was an award, it seems, that the Railroad Commission received. Could you tell us more about what they got an award for today?
Sure, they plugged an orphaned well in Matagorda Bay. They experienced three different hurricanes in the middle of that operation of trying to plug that well. And so it took them 6 months to plug the well, but it was a technical challenge. They had to coordinate across multiple different agencies, including the Texas General Land Office, and I believe some federal agencies that are involved with offshore oil and gas development. And I kind of missed this part when the meeting was going on, but I want to say they said that it cost over $90 million to plug this well, which sounds crazy. Maybe I'm wrong. But these offshore wells are very expensive to plug. And I want to say we have several, I mean, there's several dozen orphaned offshore wells that we have right now. There's different terminology too. I might be using the wrong term. There's like bay wells and then there's offshore wells. Wells that are drilled in Texas waters, I think are within 7 nautical miles from the shoreline. And then once you get further than that, it's all federal waters. And so there's different rules that apply on Texas offshore waters compared to those federal offshore waters.
So this was interesting to me too because an organization that we've worked with in the past and that you know, Virginia, is True
The
Transition,
transition, yeah,
just
Megan
released a
Milliken Bivens.
report. Yeah, just released a report about offshore well plugging, and they focused it on Louisiana, but there was a lot of similarities between Louisiana offshore wells and Texas ones. And in their report, they kind of talk about these sort of, forgotten and wells and the problems that offshore wells have. And it seems that, Texas, yes, plugged these very expensive wells, but there's still many, many others along the coast that are, in not great shape, right? Do you have a sense of how many more wells are out there in the water?
My expertise is not in offshore. That's all Megan. And so I don't have that locked away in my brain. But yeah, True Transition is a great organization to check out. And Megan Milliken Bivens was the primary author on our January 2022 Orphaned Wells report called Eliminating Orphaned Wells and Sites in Texas. She pulled together just a wealth of information in that report. Very smart lady over there. So we definitely recommend checking out True Transition.
We'll link that recent report in the comments on our Facebook page. And yeah, we'll probably link there's a really great video series, Virginia, if you remember that you and Megan did.
Oh yeah.
So I'm gonna link that one too later.
Yeah, we did a
Um,
series about our reports.
So there's some other things though in this sort of executive part of the agenda. There was a federal update about federal methane rules and how Texas is or isn't implementing them. And this has been sort of a really large ongoing topic for some time. Can you help give us some context about where the update is with that? What was said today about methane rules in general?
Sure. So I will do my best. It has gotten so technical and there's so many things going on. It has been hard to track. So the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, was supposed to begin a state implementation plan comment period this month, actually, last month or this month, to implement the federal methane rule. And so part of this federal methane rule would have required states to eliminate routine flaring by a certain date. And so we were very much in support of that methane rule. But the Trump administration has extended the compliance deadlines for the federal methane rule. It seems like they're trying to roll it back again. And this happened back in the first Trump administration. So the methane rule was first passed in the Obama administration. And then when Trump got into office, he rolled it back. And then in the Biden administration, they passed it again and with some additional components. And then now here we are in Trump round two. And so we just kind of keep getting lodged back and forth. And there's been a lot of politics involved, unfortunately. But one thing that was interesting today was that they said the Railroad Commission staff that was remarking about the federal update said that the Railroad Commission worked on joint comments about the compliance extension deadline with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. As we have been working on the state implementation plan, Railroad Commission staff have told us that they will not be implementing the methane rule. And so it's odd to us that if they think it's not in their jurisdiction, that they're working on joint comments with TCEQ. And we see this from time to time where the Railroad Commission simply opposes a federal rule because the industry opposes it, even if it's not under the Railroad Commission's jurisdiction. And they kind of hop on board and they start using their legal resources to fight that federal rule, even if the ball is not in their court. And so it's sort of frustrating to see our state resources, our limited state resources being used in this way. The thing that makes it more frustrating is that we have asked the Railroad Commission to hold in-person public hearings throughout places in Texas when they're doing a rulemaking like they did last year on waste pits and the year before on carbon dioxide injection well rules. And we asked for in-district public hearings throughout the state and they never did that. And they say they don't have resources for it, but they have the resources to spend opposing rules that are not even under their jurisdiction. And so that is very frustrating. And so let's see, EPA is right now reconsidering certain portions of the methane rule. They also have proposed eliminating what's called the endangerment finding for greenhouse gas emissions. And so there was a court case in 2008, I want to say, that found that greenhouse gas emissions do present a danger to the public and should be regulated because of that danger that they cause. And right now, EPA is proposing to eliminate the finding that greenhouse gases cause a danger to the public. And so that is the underpinning of being able to regulate greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane. And so if they're able to withdraw the endangerment finding, then it will take us even longer to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect ourselves from the worst impacts of climate change.
So it seems like there's kind of two big pieces to this update. It's that the Railroad Commission is using funds to fight implementing this methane rule. And then at the federal level, they're already considering the changing the endangerment finding or repealing it so that they wouldn't be enforcing the rule anyway. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's really sad to hear. I know in your public input today, you kind of touched on this as well and shared some health statistics that have to do with flaring and what
Yeah.
happens with flaring that's unchecked. Could you maybe get into that for us too?
Yeah, well, there was this press release that came out from the Railroad Commission last month, kind of applauding the industry because there was a study that came out showing that Permian Basin methane emissions have declined by 50% over a 2-year period. This was a flyover study, so scientists went out in airplanes and they surveyed the Permian Basin over a period of around 180 days. And so it's a really good sample size for that kind of a study. And they also used satellite data, and this whole analysis was conducted by S&P Global Insights, right? And so there's some good information in there, but the implication, right, is that the industry doesn't need to be regulated. We'll do this on our own. And that's fine, but as soon as, methane is not, a popular topic, then are they going to stop doing these kinds of studies? Are we even going to get these kinds of studies on an annual basis or on a regular basis from the industry? And so, my message to the commissioners and my public input is like the regulator plays an important role in collecting data, protecting data, and providing oversight to make sure that these things are happening and that there's no conflict of interest between, a company that actually has a financial interest in saying that their emissions are low, and doesn't have a financial interest when it turns out that their emissions are high, right? And so it's not necessarily like the private sector's place to be self-reporting all the things that they're doing that they don't want us to worry about, but that we are worried about. And then the other point that I kind of made is like, the methane emissions that they took data about don't reflect flaring emissions, right? And so when you burn methane, your instruments aren't going to detect the methane that has been burned. That's a totally different chemical that comes out the other end, namely carbon dioxide. And um, so it's also important to us to reduce flaring rates just as much as it is important to reduce methane rates. And the reason why it's important is because flaring also causes health impacts. And so there was a study in 2020 in the Eagleford Shale showing that high rates of flaring had resulted in 50% higher odds of preterm birth. And that study was in the Eagleford Shale in South Texas, not in the Permian Basin. And so we need statewide data. We need regulations that actually take into consideration our public health concerns. And yeah, we still need better oversight from the Railroad Commission and the TCEQ, even if the industry is out there doing their own thing for a little while.
And maybe you can also speak to the significance of what we've found, what Commission Shift has found, right, in research about how the Railroad Commission permits these
Hmm.
flaring sites. They. Well, maybe you can speak more about like
Yeah.
what you found and what it kind of means.
Well, and so then the troubling thing, right, is that the Railroad Commission has rules that are supposed to limit venting and flaring, and they look at that activity as a potential waste of natural resources. They don't look at it from a public health perspective, but their rules, technically, like their rules limit flaring by volume and duration. So they give permits for a specified chunk of time and for a specified amount of gas that can be emitted. Um, but we found in looking at their enforcement actions that they have never issued a violation to a company for exceeding their permit limits. They only ever issue violations for operators who submit their paperwork late. And so it's clear that there's not a verifiable well, no, there's a better way to say that. There's not a legitimate way to enforce the rules that the Railroad Commission has on the books. And they rely entirely on self-reported data from the industry, and it's just not good enough.
And on top of that, you're seeing, operators that are flaring, they're getting permits, exceptions to flare more. And so they're flaring, and the Railroad Commission says, well, they're under, the new amount that we said that you have to, be within. But that's not a win. That's just saying, wow, you're allowing so much that they don't even
Yeah, so
hit the limit.
the Railroad Commission typically permits 4 to 5 times as much volume to be vented or flared as the operators actually need. And so the permits are just way, way out of bounds, and aren't really doing anything to limit that activity from the operators.
Thanks. That's how what I was trying to say. So let's move then to the public input part of this open meeting. You had you were there in person to deliver comments. Skylar White, a rancher in West Texas, Pecos County, was also there. Do we want to kind of talk about um, maybe public input in general? We've been saying for a while that it's really difficult if you want to engage with the Railroad Commission. How accessible is this open meeting?
Yeah.
I think it's worth
Yeah.
bearing repeating.
And so, yeah, we are asking folks to ask the Railroad Commission if they can give remote public input at the open meetings. So far, the Railroad Commission keeps saying no, but we're going to keep the pressure on because most Texans in oil and gas producing regions live at least 2 hours, if not 5 hours from Austin. And making the trip to Austin to give 3 minutes of comments is just not feasible for most people. And so we really want the Railroad Commission to allow people to call in and give public input or join by video conference and give public input during the open meetings so that this is really a space that includes the people of Texas in their own government and isn't exclusive only to the people who can afford to make the trip or can afford to take a few days off of work to spend a night in a hotel and then show up at the meeting and then drive back 8 hours or however long it is. And so um, open meetings should be open. That's what we always say. Um, and so, yeah, I'll just talk briefly about what Skylar and I talked about during public input. So Skylar White is a landowner out in Pecos County who has hundreds of orphaned wells on his property. He's kind of seen every type of damage you can see from an oil and gas well on his property. And today he brought a story from 2013, there was produced water leaking into the Pecos River from a well. And it was documented by the Railroad Commission. They were trying to figure out what the source of the produced water was, but it was just flowing from the ground into the Pecos River. And then there was a big flood that kind of like washed the water away, and they weren't able to locate the source of that produced water again. And so that was concerning, but they were all lined up to do groundwater testing and all this stuff. Uh, Skylar said the reason why he brought it to fore was because Commissioner Christian at one point had pointed out that, or had said that there were never any groundwater contamination incidents caused by injection wells. And so Skylar was like, well, here's a contamination incident caused by an injection well. But today in the meeting, Christian clarified that he was talking about the surface waste disposal facilities, not the injection wells. So we could go back and look at prior open meetings to fact check that. There has been discussion about injection wells, but there's a little back and forth on like what's causing the groundwater contamination or whatever it is. I think it still stands that we need better data on groundwater contamination in Texas. And so every time that there is a leaking well, we do not see the Railroad Commission going out and taking a groundwater sample to verify groundwater cleanliness or contamination. And it would be smart if we did that. The database that we record groundwater contamination incidents in also doesn't systematically list which facility was involved or what the cause of the incident was that occurred. And so we could use an upgrade to this joint groundwater monitoring and contamination report so that we have better data to go off of on what the risks to our aquifers really are.
Speaking of risks to groundwater, I'm seeing in our notes, we do have some items about the oil field cleanup program and maybe some new information about orphaned wells here in Texas. What was shared at the open meeting today in terms of how that's going?
So the third and fourth quarter oil field cleanup program reports were presented. This is a quarterly report that the Railroad Commission produces about the wells that they have plugged each quarter and the sites that they have cleaned up. And the Railroad Commission's fiscal year ends at the end of August. So that was the end of their fourth quarter. And so now we have like the full data for fiscal year 2025. their performance measure for well plugging in fiscal year 2025 was that they were supposed to plug 2,000 wells, and they were only able to plug 1,188 throughout fiscal year 2025. And so that is a huge gap. And this is the first time in years that they have not exceeded their performance measure for well plugging. But it's also the reason why they went to the legislature at the end of the year last year and asked for an additional $100 million in funds that they could spend on emergency well plugging and other things like that. And so they did get that appropriation from the state legislature. And so now they have basically a separate pot of money that they can use for these emergencies, and they won't have to dig into their normal orphan well plugging funds for these kind of like freak emergency occurrences that have been happening. Oh, and then we got some data back via open records request, I think yesterday or today. And yeah, some frightening news. And so as of August 31st, 2025, there are now more than 10,000 orphaned wells on the books at the Railroad Commission. That's a lot of orphaned wells in Texas. When I started doing this work in 2020, there were 6,500 orphaned wells on the list. And the Railroad Commission, on average, plugs around 1,300 orphaned wells per year. So even at that rate, the number of orphaned wells has been steadily growing, if not exponentially growing in the state. And so we really are getting to some pretty bad times with well orphaning in this state. The legislature passed Senate Bill 1150 this year, but that bill won't go into effect until 2027. And then it still gives operators a 15-year runway until, what is it, 2042, for them to plug inactive wells that have been inactive for 15 years or more. So the legislature really gave way too long on this bill. I'll be surprised if these operators actually end up plugging their wells and not just completely abandoning them and leaving more orphans to the state. The good thing that did happen in Senate Bill 1150 is that the bill requires annual testing for any well that's 15 years old from the date of completion. And so as soon as that well is fracked up to age 15, if the well is inactive, it will have to be tested every year. And when those wells fail a test, they have to be plugged right away. And so there won't be plugging extensions for those wells. So I think that more of those wells will get plugged if they are failing their tests. And then that bill also should result in the Railroad Commission getting around 40 full-time equivalent staff to implement better monitoring over inactive wells. But it is getting to a really bad point. And so we want to make sure the Railroad Commission has all the tools it needs from the legislature, from a policy perspective, to be able to enforce inactive well plugging requirements.
It definitely seems like there's sort of this emerging, issue that's worsening with the orphaned wells. But in public facing meetings, at open meetings, it really feels like business as usual at the Railroad Commission. Everything's fine. We're giving each other awards. We don't have any problems. Maybe the story's a little bit different behind closed doors or at the legislature. They're, asking for funds to deal with it. But when everyday folks come to them saying we're having problems or we're seeing, a pattern, it's kind of shut down quickly. Do you think that is, do you see that changing, or is it, what do you think the future looks like for open meetings and engagement and people in the field that are experiencing, well blowouts and things? What can they expect from the Railroad Commission in addressing it?
My perception is that the Railroad Commission has started to be a little more responsive about orphaned wells and leaking inactive wells, but I'm still hearing from affected people out in the field that they have a well that's leaking and an investigator goes to look at it and they say it's not leaking bad enough. Call us when it's leaking more. And like, that's not how their prioritization system works for orphaned wells. If it's leaking, it should be like up at the top, high priority to plug and clean up. And so, and then, as we've seen from Laura Briggs, they waited a year to plug a well on your property that was leaking until it blew out and became an even worse problem. And there are lots of examples of these sites becoming worse problems because the Railroad Commission couldn't get to it fast enough. And there's a lot of solutions to this problem. One of the solutions is we need to tighten well transfer requirements for active operators. You know, like a bigger company shouldn't just be able to offload its assets to a small company and then go on about its way. We need to make sure those companies are also still held liable for the plugging costs. And then we need to update the financial assurance requirements, the bonding requirements. You know, we've talked before about how some of these wells are bonded at less than $250 per well when it costs at least $40,000 to plug a well. And so, you know, it's time to catch up our laws and our regulations with the times and to meet the moment, because we really are getting into a crisis situation here. And, you know, these wells present a risk to groundwater. Again, we have been through drought too much in this state to be putting our groundwater at more risk.
Thanks, Virginia. And I did do a quick Google and look through our email thread about just going back to the orphaned wells that are offshore. And it does seem like, according to the last research into this, there is at least 100 offshore. So they did plug 8, but there are hundreds orphaned. And then on top of that, inactive ones that are still on the book, some operators' books, but in what kind of condition. So just adding more to that picture, in and around Texas. Um, but that I think catches us up with some of our big takeaways from the meeting today. Is there any other items that we want to dip into?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing that I sort of added to my public input was just what we're hearing from a lot of people in the oil field. You know, I think throughout the state, we talk to people who are afraid to speak out because they're afraid to lose their job. They're afraid of being physically harassed or harmed if they do speak out against any of the companies that they've seen polluting or being bad actors. And that's terrible. You know, it's not like who we are as Texans. I don't think that it's what the railroad commissioners want for the oil and gas industry, like the kind of reputation that they want the industry to have. And so I asked the commissioners to, you know, use their position as leaders in this industry to denounce that kind of threat and intimidation that we're hearing about in the oil field. And you know, it's one of those things where people rarely come forward with hard evidence of what has happened. You know, if somebody tells them something in person, it's kind of hard to capture that in the moment or have any evidence of it happening. And so, you know, even though it's illegal to do that, to intimidate somebody in that way or to threaten their job in that way, it's hard to actually seek justice in a situation like that. And so, um, we need the oil and gas industry's culture to change. And I think the railroad commissioners are kind of, you know, leaders in that culture. And so we need to see something from them that sets the standard for how these companies should engage with the public.
I'm glad you brought that forth. I think that is something that we've all heard in conversations about being intimidated or threatened, or even just socially excluded, like ostracized, right? And it isn't spoken about enough, probably because it is hard to bring it out to the light because it can happen, in these, private moments or, before you can even realize it's happening, or through the pressure that you're feeling around you. So I'm glad that you spoke up about it, and it'll be interesting to see what the railroad commissioners, if they respond,
Yeah.
and take that leadership on. All right, on that note, maybe we can end on just encouraging people to engage and participate, because it is so important, because what's at stake is so large, here in Texas. And if you have any stories of impact, reach out and we can help, prepare people to engage with the Railroad Commission, to make their voice heard at these open meetings, and to help us, build up that pressure that we're asking for more transparency, more accessibility, and that the Railroad Commission has the ability to do those things. They just need to have the desire to do those things. They need to hear it from as many people as possible. So definitely follow us on our social channels. Sign up for our newsletter if you haven't yet. You can do that at commissionshift.org. And there's lots of resources in there as well for folks who live near oil and gas development. Um, and we'll be back for the next Railroad Commission open meeting in October, um, October 28th. So we'll be back with updates then. And if you have questions or comments, definitely send us a message or drop us a comment on our Facebook page or wherever you see this debrief. And Virginia, thanks for joining us and walking us through all these
Thanks,
items.
SJ. Thanks everybody for watching. Take care.